Previously on the American Justice Podcast.
And you have to remember that what happened here, and 9 days later, a truthful person is not going to remember everything verbatim. In fact, I'd be more concerned about someone that did remember everything verbatim. And that tells me that it was thought out beforehand, and it was thought out between the day it happened and 9 days later with the interview. And many times he didn't remember, didn't recall.
There is an epidemic in America's criminal justice system: the prosecution and conviction of innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Welcome to American Justice. The American Justice Podcast Army works to free men and women wronged by the criminal justice system. It's not only about the innocent who have been imprisoned, but also the victims of the crimes as well. No one deserves justice more than them. And now, here's your host, Scott Pogensy.
Hello, American Justice Army. Welcome back to your podcast. Last week, we started to get into the actual forensics that showed and proved Brandon's whereabouts the night of October 16th, 2005. The night that Dennis and Norma Woodruff were presumed to have been killed. Some of you astute listeners may have noticed that I keep saying presumed to have been killed, or the night Ranger Collins believes the Woodruffs were murdered. Presumed is definitely the key word in that sentence. I feel like I should explain myself for just a minute. When we get into the forensics of the crime scene and the medical examiner's testimony and trial, you'll learn that the exact time of death has not been able to be definitively determined. There are certain things that I have been able to analyze that show the Woodruffs were not murdered during the 9:30 to 10:15 time frame that Ranger Collins and the overzealous prosecutors believed. The most frustrating thing is that all of the information was already there. I just went back and looked at it from a fresh perspective. But I just wanted you to know why I keep reiterating that it's the time that Ranger Collins believes the couple to have perished. At some point in the season, we will discuss why I believe Dennis and Norma were still alive past 10:15 p.m. You'll just have to trust me for now. But you may be asking yourself right about now, why is that even significant? Here's why. If the forensics show that the high school sweethearts were murdered any time after 10:04 p.m., then that will prove, beyond any doubt, with 100% certainty, that Brandon Woodruff is completely innocent. So let's begin. I hate to start off the episode with a patent-pending Scott Pogensy personal opinion, but I feel like I must. If you sit back and really think about it, when it comes to a trial or when it comes to proving whether or not Brandon had a hand in the slaughtering of his parents, what matters more? What Brandon said he did at the times that he said he did them, or the places that he was proven to have gone, and the times that were proven he did them? Let's take it to an extreme. Let me set up a hypothetical situation for you. Let's just say that it was proven that Dennis and Norma were killed at 11 p.m. I don't know how. Maybe somebody was on the phone with them at 11 p.m. when they heard screaming and gunshots. So we would know, in this imaginary scenario, that the couple died at 11 p.m. Now, let's say, as part of this example, that Brandon says he was back at Abilene at 11 p.m. But then they uncover a videotape of him at Walmart in Royce City at 11:30 p.m., buying bleach and large trash bags and big towels. As we discussed before, Abilene is a good 3 hours away from Royce City. Let's also say that the phone records show that he was making calls from Royce City cell phone towers right around midnight. Which would matter more? Where Brandon said he was, or the videotape you have of him buying murder paraphernalia at Walmart? Obviously, the videotape and phone records would matter more. Evidence and facts are what should lead to a conviction, not speculation and hearsay, regardless of the credentials of the person doing the speculating. Not everyone with a badge is always right. Not everyone with a law degree is always right. That's why all of their offices are filled with shelves containing books of law explanations. They're for reading, studying, and fact-checking. Reference material to ensure you don't wrongfully convict someone out of the uneducated practices. Now, if you have had the pleasure of ever seeing a bookshelf in an attorney's office, did you happen to notice how much dust was on them? Hire and trust the ones who have the cleaner books. Just a bit of friendly advice. So why is it different in this case? Why did the phone records not matter more than the couple of hours that Brandon was mistaken on his timeline? Remember, in the made-up scenario we just talked about, Brandon would have straight up lied and tried to cover up his whereabouts. In the real-life scenario, Brandon stated several times that he wasn't sure about the times and begged Ranger Collins to check out his alibis and other records because he just couldn't remember exact times. Several times, Brandon stated, "I'm not sure," and "I'm trying to give you the best answer I can," and those type of statements. And as you heard last week, Terry Jones and Ranger Collins both promised Brandon that they would check out those alibis. Little did Brandon know that Ranger Collins would not fulfill that promise until he was safely, securely, and in my opinion, unethically behind bars. Truth or not, Ranger Collins' quick-fire jump to an arrest displayed to his peers that he was, indeed, a real, rootin'-tootin' Texas Ranger, and not the partially cocked, half-witted investigator we've all come to know and love. We will get into the information in the arrest warrant soon, but for now, just trust me. It's not what you might think would be contained in an arrest affidavit. When I saw it with my own eyes, I was shocked that it wasn't written in purple crayon and covered with stick figures holding pistols saying the word pew pew in comic book style conversation bubbles. All right, let's get started with the episode. When we left off last week, Brandon was explaining how he got the time that he met up with Robert at Denny's. When Robert told him it was around 9 p.m., he went into the meeting with Ranger Collins with that knowledge. So when Ranger Collins puts him leaving the Heath house at 8 p.m., Brandon's thinking to himself, okay, leave the Heath house at 8, arrive at Denny's around 9, that's when Robert told me it was, so yep, sounds about right. As Brandon would say many times after he was arrested, had he known that Ranger Collins was really looking at him as a real suspect, he would have gone back and checked his phone or checked the toll records, maybe checked with more of his friends, the stuff Ranger Collins should have done. Although, even when Ranger Collins did get around to interviewing his friends, they were almost all off on their times. Damn teenage boys. Can't any of you afford to buy watches? Personally, for the sake of ever needing to defend myself against similar accusations in the future, It makes me want to begin a detailed diary of my scheduled whereabouts every second of every day. But then again, isn't that what social media is now? If only society had treated MySpace like Facebook or Instagram back in 2005. I know, wishful afterthoughts. But anyway, back to the forensics. I'm about to delve into a subject that is going to take some time to explain. When Ranger Collins wrote the subpoenas for the phone records, he asked for several people's calls, not just Brandon's. When it came to the home phone, Ranger Collins either did not ask for the records or was not able to obtain them from the phone company. Luckily, some investigator processing the crime scene was astute enough to write down the calls on the caller ID from the wireless handset. So here are the people that Ranger Collins did subpoena cell phone records for: Brandon, Dennis, Norma, Charla, Alex Ruley, the friend that Brandon met up with in Plano to get ready for the club, Robert Martinez, Brandon's friend that he brought with him from ACU that weekend, Brandon's girlfriend at the time, Morgan Lee, and one last person. Can you guess who it is? Yep, you got it. Shit kicker number one himself, Mike Etherington. Finally, Ranger Collins did something worthy of that badge that he wears on his belt, or his chest. I'm sure he wears it somewhere. But hey, it's time to throw the confetti and release the balloons. He subpoenaed Mike's phone records. Okay. Sorry, I like to celebrate when cops do something right. Now, I'm sure it just entered your mind. Wow, Scott. So did Ranger Collins check Mike's phone records against where he said he was? Well, that's a difficult question to answer. We'll never know if he actually looked at Mike's calls, but what I can tell you is that Ranger Collins did not actually get the phone records until May of 2006, some 7 months after Brandon was in jail, and 7 months after the last time that Ranger Collins talked to Mike. There was no record in Ranger Collins' investigative report about talking to Mike ever again after he interviewed him the day after Brandon was arrested. We'll start covering that interview in another episode or two. Oh, I can't wait for that one. All right. Wait, hold on just a second. Didn't we hear last week that Ranger Collins promised Brandon during his interrogation that he would check out Brandon's alibis and phone records? Yep, he did. But did he? Sure, after Brandon was already arrested. This would get back to the point that I just made a few minutes ago. Why would Ranger Collins arrest Brandon without checking out the phone records? What happens if the phone records prove his innocence? We'll get to that in a few moments. But first, I want you to think about this. With an arrest made long before that evidence was even obtained, anything added to the story, any evidence that came in after the arrest, could have been meticulously molded to fit the outcome. Imagine watching the end of a movie first, and then going back and starting it from the beginning. Your brain would most definitely and automatically take every bit of information experienced in those opening scenes to bridge what you had witnessed from already seeing the final destination of the film's plot. It's just how our mind works. I would have been so pissed off if someone told me that Bruce Willis was already dead in The Sixth Sense, or if I had been tipped off that Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father. Oops. A late spoiler alert for those of you that have never watched those films, but hey, at least I wouldn't have screamed out, "No way!" in the theater like I did when Haley Joel Osment said his famous line, "I see dead people." Maybe that would have actually been a good thing. I was pretty embarrassed when that happened. All right, back to the case. Why is it significant that the phone records were not checked out first? Before the arrest. Well, as we talked about earlier, what happens if what Brandon told Ranger Collins was mistaken and the phone records proved his innocence? Well, now you've got yourself in a proverbial Ranger Collins pickle. You have someone arrested and presented to the general public as guilty, yet they are actually not guilty. Quite a PR quandary you got there. But if the phone records show he's guilty, what a sigh of relief, huh? But my question is this. Why not just wait until you get the phone records to prove or disprove your theory before you make an arrest? Isn't arresting someone for capital murder a big deal to this guy? Isn't it important that you get the right guy? Maybe not to Ranger Collins, but then again, this type of conviction looks amazing on a resume when seeking an inevitable promotion or securing future employment with different agencies. The other odd thing about this is that Ranger Collins is convinced Brandon is lying to him. I am still, to this day, not sure what made Ranger Collins so convinced that Brandon was lying. Now, we can all agree, can we not, that lying to someone and being mistaken about something are two different things. For example, if I tell you that you look good in that pink dress, that would be a lie. If I tell you that you just wore that pink dress 3 weeks ago, but it was really 3 weeks and a day ago, that would be a mistake. But what was it about Brandon that convinced Ranger Collins, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Brandon was being nefarious? Why would it have been a big deal for Ranger Collins to say to Brandon, "You know what, Brandon? We have a neighbor that says that you were at the Heath house between 10 and 11 p.m. Is it possible that you're off on your times? What would you think about me subpoenaing your phone records? How would that make you feel?" I have a feeling that Brandon would have been very welcoming to that notion. All right, so am I just totally off base here? Would that not have been a more prudent approach to the subject? Any of you investigators or retired investigators out there, let me know if I'm completely wrong. I'll wait for your call. I'll be right here. Okay, so back to the phone records. The last we talked about, Brandon had made a phone call to his mom to tell her that the horses had already been let out to pasture and that she would have to bathe Honey sometime the next week. That was at 7:36 p.m. All right, so moving right along, let's see where Brandon's next phone call was. Let's see. Let me check Brandon's phone records. Hold on. I know I have them here somewhere. Hold on. I know I had them at the computer? No, wait. Oh yeah, that's right. There are no phone records for the time in question. That's right. The time that is so crucial. Between that phone call at 7:36 p.m. and the time that Brandon was known to have met up with Robert at Denny's, there were no phone calls turned over by the police to the court, to the defense, or to this diligent investigating podcast host. What you're about to hear would make the difference in this case. It would prove that Ranger Collins and the lackeys at the sheriff's department were either the most inept investigators ever to walk the face of the earth, or the most corrupt. I'll let you decide when we're done. Let's start this journey with Brandon in jail. Just a few days after he was arrested, Brandon was introduced to his new defense team of Scott Cornad and Jerry Spencer Davis. Brandon immediately tells them, "Get my phone records. You'll see I wasn't there that night. They were alive when I left them." Kind of an odd plea for someone that's guilty, don't you think? So your first thought as Brandon's new defense team would be to get Brandon's phone records, right? Right. I'm not sure about all of the legalities of it, but basically it was determined that it was the prosecution's job to get the phone records from the cell phone companies. I do know that the judge in the case had to make a court order for the companies to turn over the records, but that's all I know as far as the legalities go. However, the court records show that the battle to get Brandon's records would be epic, to say the least. I was able to count 6 times that Jerry Spencer Davis had to go back to court and ask the judge to get the prosecution to turn over the phone records to the defense. The excuses from the Hunt County DA's office ranged from they didn't have them yet to the Deputy United States Marshal that was receiving the records had not turned them over yet to they just didn't have time to go through them yet. Needless to say, Brandon's number one cry from jail was begging his defense team to get the records so he could be exonerated and let out of the hell that he was going through behind bars. However, for whatever reason, the prosecution took their sweet Texas time turning them over. So that was the court battle. Now, let's listen to Ranger Collins talk about when they actually did get the records and how he handled them. Just remember, this is about 7 months after Brandon's been in jail already. Okay, here we go.
Ranger Sergeant Collins, Investigative Report 17.1 through 17.5. Ranger Sergeant Collins made contact with United States Deputy Marshal Kirk King, who assisted Ranger Sergeant Collins in the execution of court orders for telephone records in this investigation, and had agreed to interpret the records. On Thursday, 5/18/06, and Wednesday, 5/24/06, Deputy Marshal King met with Ranger Sergeant Collins at the Hunt County Criminal Justice Center with the records that had been sent to him in response to the court orders for telephone records. Ranger Sergeant Collins requested that Deputy Marshal King first review and interpret the data contained within the cellular telephone records for Brandon Woodruff's cellular phone to see if the records could help pinpoint Brandon Woodruff's location on 10/16/05 and see if the cellular telephone records supported Brandon Woodruff's alibi or supported the numerous witness statements obtained by Ranger Sergeant Collins indicating Brandon Woodruff was lying about his location during the time frame associated with the deaths of Dennis and Norma Woodruff. Brandon Woodruff's cellular telephone records showed that on Sunday, 10/16/05, Brandon Woodruff made a call at 8:54 a.m. and did not make another call until 10:46 p.m. The records show that Brandon Woodruff made 4 telephone calls after that. A 1-minute call to Martina's phone at 10:46 p.m., a 2-minute call to Rully at 10:49 p.m., a 3-minute call to Martinez at 10:51 p.m., and a 1-minute call to Rully at 11:02 p.m. Deputy Marshal King was able to show the cell tower sites for each of the 4 calls from 10:46 to 11:02 for Ranger Sergeant Collins. The site information showed that at 10:46, Brandon Woodruff was hitting a cellular tower located at 5123 Northwest Drive in Mesquite, Texas. The call was coming from the southeast quadrant of the tower, placing Brandon Woodruff around Interstate 30 and Beltline Road. The call placed at 10:49 p.m. indicated that Brandon Woodruff was hitting a cellular tower located at 4040 Town Crossing Boulevard in Mesquite, Texas. The call would have placed Brandon Woodruff in the vicinity of Interstate 30 and US 635 in Mesquite. The call placed at 10:51 p.m. indicated that Brandon Woodruff was hitting a cellular tower located at 1015 West Centerville Road in Garland, Texas, and would place Brandon Woodruff on US 635 north of Interstate 30. And the call placed at 11:02 p.m. indicated that Brandon Woodruff was hitting a cellular tower located at 9401 El Beche Freeway, Dallas, Texas. The cellular telephone records clearly showed that Brandon Woodruff lied to Ranger Sergeant Collins when providing an alibi and showed that the witness statements obtained by Ranger Sergeant Collins were accurate as to where Brandon Woodruff was. The phone records showed Brandon Woodruff coming from the direction of the murders of Dennis and Norma Woodruff and from the Heath address during the time frame right after the murders, just as was reported by Lunds.
Okay, there you have it. A couple of quick notes I'd like to point out about what you just heard. First, Ranger Collins actually puts it in his investigative report that Brandon lied to him about where he was that night. Pay very special attention to that word, where. Brandon never told Ranger Collins that he went someplace that he didn't. It has never been in question where Brandon was that night. He said he ate dinner, he went to the Heath house, he went to the club, went back to school. The state has never argued that that was not where Brandon was that night. The only thing that was ever in question was what time he did those things. Even Ranger Collins never questioned where Brandon was that night. Yet here we have Ranger Collins putting in an official government document that Brandon lied about where he went that night. I'm not trying to make a mountain out of a molehill here, but this is a big deal. Anyone reading this report would think that Brandon just started making stuff up about where he went that night and lied all over the place. The next thing about this particular passage is the use of the word lied. I just looked up the word lied on Webster.com to see what a proper definition is. It says, quote, to make an untrue statement with the intent to deceive, end quote. And the word intent is even underlined and bolded and italicized. The reason for that is that in order for someone to lie, they have to make an untrue statement with the intent to deceive, or the intent to portray something in one way when they really knew it was another. We just talked a little bit ago about the difference between a mistake and a lie. Yet here's Ranger Collins saying that Brandon lied to him about his timeline. That means that somehow Ranger Collins had to get inside Brandon's head to know for an absolute certainty that Brandon was being deceitful. I wonder what made him think that. I really do. Maybe it was the fact that Brandon told him over and over again that he wasn't sure. Maybe it was the fact that Brandon struggled over and over again to even think of a time to give Ranger Collins. Maybe it was the fact that Ranger Collins knew he had no other suspect, and the only way to arrest someone for this crime would be to portray Brandon as a big fat liar. Remember that definition of lie. It'll come up in a significant way later on in our story. The last thing I want to talk to you about concerning that single passage is the fact that Brandon's friends that he said he was with that night, that Ranger Collins actually interviewed, were completely off on their times as well. In fact, even Alex Ruley told Ranger Collins that he contacted a friend that was an attorney to see what he should do. The attorney friend told him to write down all of his times so that he knew exactly what time he was where. So, the time that Alex told Ranger Collins that Brandon arrived at his house that night? Between 10:30 and 10:45 p.m. As we'll talk about next week, Brandon's cell phone was hitting a tower in Mesquite at 10:46 p.m. on the way to pick up Robert at Denny's. That's over 20 minutes away from Alex's house. And this was a guy that had to sit down, pull out his phone, and go over his timeline minute by minute that night. However, Ranger Collins never accused Alex of being a cold-blooded killer. He never accused Alex of lying to him. We haven't gotten there yet, but all of the kids Brandon was with that night were off on their timelines. Yet Ranger Collins never made any accusation towards any of them that they were, quote, lying to him. They got a pass because they were 19-year-old kids. Not Brandon, though. Brandon was lying. All right, what have we learned here today, boys and girls? That's right. We've learned that words mean things. If someone is telling you something that you know not to be true, you had better damn well know the intent before you accuse them of lying. And when words are used in the wrong way, they can also be used to put an innocent person in prison. All right, back to the forensics of the phone calls. In the passage you heard, Ranger Collins is now admitting to you some very key points. First, Deputy Marshal King was to interpret the phone records first and then bring them to him for them to both go over. Wait, what? That's right, ladies and gentlemen. What this means is that the defense team did not receive the raw records from the phone companies themselves. Why is that? Why not just turn over the actual records and let the attorneys deal with getting them interpreted? Well, it probably wouldn't be a huge deal if all the phone records were there. But I'll let Brandon's ex-employer and longtime supporter Edie Bullock tell you what happened.
There were a lot of things when it came to the phone records. Unfortunately, the defense did not order those records. They were ordered by the prosecution many, many months later. And they didn't have all of Brandon's records. So all of the phone records were having to be pieced together by phone calls that he had made to other people by those phones that we knew he had called that day. We weren't aware of every phone call that he had made, but we did know some of the people that he had talked to, and we could piece those phone records together.
Yep, you heard that right. Not all of the phone records made it over to the defense. Did they make it to the prosecution? We'll never know. But they definitely did not make it to the defense table. And as you just heard Edie tell you, in order to piecemeal Brandon's phone calls together that night, they had to look at all of the other people's phone calls that they subpoenaed. For example, we know that Brandon talked to his girlfriend at 9:41 p.m. that night because she called him. So we know that there was a phone call between the two at 9:41, not because we have Brandon's calls, but because we have Morgan's calls. Then they saw a call from Brandon on Robert's call log, so they know that that happened, etc. I'm sure you get the picture at this point. However, here's a very key point that most people seem to forget when talking about this case. In next week's episode, we'll get into how the phone records prove the, quote, murder window that Brandon had to commit the executions, if he was the one that did it. We're going to have to use Robert's phone records, Morgan's phone records, Alex's phone records, etc. You know, people that we actually have phone records for. However, and this is what is so key, what if Brandon made calls to someone that we don't have call records for? What if he made a call to his grandmother, or his friend that was caring for his snake back at college, or his bank to see how much his credit card had left on it. I mean, he was about to go out to the club that night. He might need to know that. Brandon could have been making dozens of calls that we'll never know about because the prosecution never turned over Brandon's records for the times in question. Whether or not that was on purpose, we'll never know. But the important thing is that it never happened. Okay, so let me summarize everything you've just heard. Brandon wanted everyone to check his phone records because he knew that that would exonerate him. The defense had to fight to even get the phone records. When they finally did get them, Brandon's records had some calls missing. Now, here's the part that everyone needs to understand. It wasn't just some random day that had a couple missing calls. It was, as far as I've been able to analyze, only one day. Yep, you guessed it. The day of the murders. October 16th, 2005 was the one and only day that had any records missing. Let me repeat that. We have 90 days worth of Brandon Woodruff's phone calls, and there are only calls missing on one day within those records. The day that Dennis and Norma Woodruff were presumed to have been killed. The last call logged the morning of the 16th is 8:54 a.m. The very next call that is logged on Brandon's phone records is 10:46 p.m. That is only 8 minutes short of being 14 hours that is completely missing. Did the investigators not notice that there were 14 hours missing on a 19-year-old's phone records that, by all accounts from every other day, was addicted to his phone? Really? 14 hours, ladies and gentlemen? 14 hours. Ugh. All right. Thanks for hanging with me, AJ Army. Next week, we're going to focus on the time between when Norma was last reported alive at 9:30 p.m. to when Brandon met up with Robert at Denny's. After all, once Brandon meets up with his friends, his alibis are set in stone. But where did the phone records and cell towers show Brandon was that night? After all, we started off this episode talking about the difference between which was more important, where he said he was, or where it was shown that he was. We'll answer that question along with a lot more next week. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Have a safe and healthy week. Here's a little preview of next week. Until then, remember to stay aware, stay strong, and get involved. See you then.
And then we know that at 10:51 to 11, he's meeting Robert Martinez. What we don't know, if we stick to the defendant's timeline, is what he's doing between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m.
The American Justice Podcast is owned and copyrighted by Atua Productions, LLC. Your host is Scott Pogensey, and your writer is C. Derick Miller. The theme music for the American Justice Podcast has been created and composed by Josh DeRosa. Scripted and recorded episodes are published every Sunday morning, with follow-up Q&A episodes released on Fridays. You can find the Q&A episodes on YouTube by searching for American Justice Podcast. Atua Productions aims for this to be an interactive podcast where you, the audience, has a great amount of influence on the content of our shows. You can interact with us in several ways. First, and most preferred, is you can leave us a voicemail. Our phone number is 972-942-0444. Be sure to leave your name and the city you're calling from, along with whether or not we can use your voice on the air. If Facebook is more your style, you can log on to our Facebook page at facebook.com/American Justice Podcast. Feel free to leave a comment, or you can message us on Messenger if you have a more pressing question or issue. If you would like to blog about the show, then you can log on to AmericanJusticePodcast.com and tell us what you think there. You can find many of the documents discussed in this episode there as well. If you are a tweeter, you can also voice your opinion on Twitter at AJusticePodcast. If you would like to support the show, you can do so in a couple different ways. First, consider visiting our Patreon page at patreon.com/AJPodcast. We have different levels of support that include t-shirts, guest call-in spots, and early access to our podcast and YouTube shows. Next, you can like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to get notifications of when we publish episodes. We would also very much appreciate it if you could give us a 5-star review. If you have any comments about the show, or more importantly, any tips on the case we're discussing, please call 972-942-0444 and leave us a message. After all, if the subject of our podcast is innocent, that means someone out there is guilty. American Justice Army? Let's find them.